Well, Karen, first of all, thank you so much for doing this interview. I'm very excited to sort of hear your perspective on Fritz Ascher and his landscapes, and particularly his late work. So really, wherever you want to go with this is great. It's great with me.
I'm very happy to do this. As you know, I'm very, very interested in Ascher. Well, Ascher's a fascinating figure anyway, and I'm enormously grateful to Rachel Stern for having introduced me to this amazing artist whom I knew nothing about. And I very cockily thought I was well informed about German modernism. I mean, I even know about Max Slaybaugh, but I knew nothing about Ascher, and I was very excited to, as I say, when Rachel introduced me to his work. And as we just leafed through the images, I became more and more aware that there was one group of images, like these trees or this sunset, that were completely different from the rest of the images. And as I got to know more and more about Ascher, I discovered that these works, which were the ones that were really capturing my attention and I felt were enormously powerful, were the work of his last years, the years after World War II, which he spent in hiding. And the whole story is so fascinating, but the very distinct bodies of work before and after make it even more interesting.
Well, so let's start with these late works, because I agree with you 100%. They're fascinating, and I think that idea of, given his narrative, given the fact that he underwent or he was exposed to so much trauma, that he demonstrated a shift in some ways in terms of his subject matter and what he was interested in after the war, the degree to which these late works do kind of feel, as you said, a little different. There's something about them. So in your mind, if you look at works like these, how would you describe them? What is in your mind, the sort of effective quality of these works that attract you? How would you describe them in terms of technique? What drew you to them specifically from an aesthetic point of view?
Compared to Ascher's earlier work, which looks very much of its time, kind of, early 20th century Expressionism, you can read his whole history in that. The fact that as a very young artist, he was supported by Max Liebermann, who was the leading artist of the day, Lovis Corinth, who was also someone he was in contact with, obviously artists much older than he was. He was a teenager, I think, when Liebermann suggested which school he should enroll in. And then there are these expressive, figurative works, often with very, very dramatic subjects, often even more dramatic than the one you have on the screen. And then the post-war landscapes, particularly these trees that he returned to obsessively, these full top chunky trees that in groups of 2 or 3 or singly, some sunsets, some sunrises, and sunflowers. And it's a very circumscribed group of subjects, which compared to the early figurative narrative works seem deliberately neutral, as though having been in hiding during the war, thanks to a devoted friend. When he did no painting, he only wrote poetry. When he starts painting again, one of the first things he does is take some of his earlier work and essentially cancel it out. He paints on top of it with abstract gestures. And then the other work starts, which is very much related to where he is at the time. he is living in Grunwald in the where he had hidden as well, and he is walking in the forest every day. So instead of these rather, I don't want to say mannered because they're better than that, but these very stylized early figurative works, you have much more freely, much more directly painted, and to my eye, more personal work than the work that originally started winning him a reputation, that now looks very much of its time and place.
It's really interesting to think about your characterization of his early work, like The Loner, as something that is much more studied, much more intentional, much more deliberate, as opposed to your thinking of his later works, which are primarily landscapes, once he sort of progresses beyond sort of annotating, expressively annotating on top of his earlier pieces, as something that the subjects and the techniques seem a bit freer, perhaps a little bit more organic to him and more naturally expressive. Would that be a way of kind of characterizing the difference?
That's one way of saying it. I mean, they're certainly not conventional.
Mm-hmm.
They're not literal,
Mm-hmm.
even though the subject matter is recognizable, any more than the early work was not literal. It was, but the early work had much more grand manner ambition in terms of the narratives, as you say, and certainly in terms of what some of the older leading artists were doing. He's almost a generation younger than the German Expressionists, but he certainly knew their work.
Mm-hmm.
And you can start thinking of, in a work like The Loner, you start thinking, well, what was Beckmann doing at the time? That same kind of supercharged figuration.
Mm-hmm.
Early Ascher is not doing what Beckmann is doing. I'm just trying to put them in a similar boat, as it were.
You can see the lineage in a way.
You can see the lineage. And that age, by the way, is one of the reasons that Ascher kind of disappears, because he's really reaching his maturity just as National Socialism hits.
Mm-hmm.
He's 40 years old when Hitler comes to power.
Yeah.
And you know, he had a very, very difficult time. Arrested twice, released because of the influential friends. I mean, he was extremely lucky. He came from a wealthy, assimilated Jewish family, which converted, except for his mother,
Right.
which meant he was, because it's a matrilineal identification, he was seen as a Jew, even though converted, and a modernist painter. That's two strikes against him.
Sure, for sure. It's a fascinating thing to think about, as you said, sort of at the peak, the moment in which he would have emerged with this style as kind of his calling card, which, as you say,
not to interrupt, but he was already attracting attention for this.
Right.
You know, he's known for this. Sorry.
No, but it's interesting. I guess maybe a better way of phrasing it would be sort of at the moment when he would have been able to really start embracing and getting even more traction for the acclaim that he was starting to kind of rack up. At that particular moment, that key point in his career, that's when the persecution started. But it's interesting to think about where he went on the other side. Once he had freedom, once he was no longer in hiding, what it means that he turned to landscapes like these, things that I'm curious, you use the term neutral to describe these later works. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by, as opposed to the earlier periods here in the sort of post-war landscapes, the subject is a bit more neutral, as you said. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
No, not at all. I mean, in comparison to these biblical stories and allegories and symbolic figurative narratives, or symbolic narratives enacted by figures of the pre-war work, you have subject matter which has no story attached to it. And, you know, something as straightforward as a row of trees, you can't even attach to that ideas about the romantic attitudes towards nature.
Mm.
And I find that very interesting because there is, after all, this very, very powerful idea which was taught in German schools until very, very recently. I mean, my contemporaries and friends, all German friends, all had this, and that is the idea of being one with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, has been used in many not so pleasant ways, because if you go back to Hermann's victory over the Romans, which is one of the defining moments of German identity for National Socialism. But until that happened, until the Nazis took it over, it had another kind of connotation, and that is that the people who live close to nature, like Hermann's Teutonic tribes, as opposed to the hyper-civilized Romans, people who live close to nature have special characteristics and special relationships to the world. You get it in the 18th century with Rousseau and the idea of bringing up the child as close to nature. But it's a very, very powerful idea for Germans. And it explains why so many of them will take their clothes off at the least provocation and rush into the freezing Baltic, you know, and sit on stony beaches. But it's definitely part of the psyche. Now, you could argue for a Jewish family, maybe it's not so powerful, but a family that was as assimilated as Ascher's, and someone growing up in the sophisticated city of Berlin was certainly going to be exposed to this. So to have the Grunewald there and to be able to go back after being literally in hiding, literally in a basement, to be out in the open air, we all feel it now, having been housebound. And to be in this forest and to be confronting a world which was not populated by evil, threatening people. I think that's what I mean by neutral.
Do you feel, I mean, thinking to your point about the sort of German tradition of connecting with nature and sort of visual representations of this human connection with nature and the value of that and the forest and sort of the mythic role the forest has played historically and obviously under less than savory conditions during National Socialism. But, you know, Ascher's forest feels very different to me.
It does.
And I don't, you know, to your point that it doesn't necessarily track exactly with what would be a sort of celebration of nature and connection to the natural world. To me, when I think of that disconnect between the tradition and Ascher's iteration, I keep coming back to color and how color functions in these landscapes, as opposed to even the figures, and I use that word deliberately, of the trees. I feel as though the driving force, you have these, oftentimes these kind of silhouetted trees or silhouetted identifiable entities in the forest, but you have in the background, you know, this vibrant color that is just almost creating a parallel narrative that supersedes any indication of the forest as the dominant subject. I don't know.
I think that's a very accurate description. And he is, after all, formed as a painter in the early years of the 20th century, when he's seeing the work of painters for whom color is a primary carrier of emotion and an expression of passion, of anger, of all kinds of things. So I think that's in his, that's part of his vocabulary. And you're right. I mean, the trees are usually silhouetted. And when you say figure about the trees, I couldn't agree with you more, because they become surrogate people. And when you see a lot of them, and there'll be a group, different groupings and different dispositions of them, they do start reading like a crowd. And I also start seeing those sunflowers often as heads, and sometimes the single ones as portraits. So the impulse that drove his early narrative paintings is still in there somewhere, but it's as though this has become a metaphorical way of expressing those deep feelings. You see it in his poetry, which is very passionate. When I say neutral, I don't mean that these are paintings without affect or without an intense emotion. I simply meant that he's very deliberately choosing subject matter that is not loaded in the same way. And you're right, this isn't like a romantic painting. I'm thinking about Caspar David Friedrich, with the landscape is charged with supposedly religious spiritual meaning, and some little figure is standing there contemplating it. It has nothing to do with this.
Yes. Well, it's interesting to think, returning to your point about how this is in some ways a continuation of his interest in the body and in the figure, though sort of sublimated into something that, as you say, reads a bit more neutrally. It reads not as something that is meant to symbolize, per se, as you said, sort of a religious awakening or something of that kind, but perhaps it's the only vehicle for expression as a result of his experiences during the war. Perhaps it's a way that he is able to continue this tradition in which he was trained and in which he came of age. But there's something about the landscape that allows him to do it, whereas directly representing a figure, perhaps that's something that he's not able to do. Do you view this as almost like a traumatic response to or a trauma-related response to his experience during the war? The idea, or is it something different?
Obviously, all of those years of persecution, hiding, bombardments, he was not ignorant of what was going on in the world around him. Of course, this is a traumatic response. And how can anyone live through that and not be deeply, deeply affected? Whether it was in any way conscious, frankly, I would doubt it. I think he may have even questioned the value of making art in this world. I have no idea. But the fact that he's just very deliberately restricting himself to subjects where he can think about form, think about color. You might use his analogy, Morandi's still lives, where he is using the most banal household objects, the kind of thing that you used to be able to buy in any flea market, the detritus of a sort of lower middle class Italian home of his time. And at one point, he's describing a painting in a letter to one of his critic friends, a very eminent writer, Cesare Brandi, and he starts saying it, and he says, "Oh, it's my usual things, they work very well, don't you think?" And so those cups and those bottles, and which he deliberately neutralized. He used to pour paint into the bottles or choose milk glass, so it was non-reflective. He used to wrap the boxes in paper, anything to flatten them out and make them more less responsive to shiny light. And you could argue that Ascher's trees are like Morandi's cups and bottles. They're a form that he knows well, but he can vary every time.
It's a easy sort of a vessel for exploration. It's something where you can start from it and you can do, whether it's something that's a color exploration, whether it's form, whether it's technique, or whether it's emotional, depending on if you can sort of view these trees as anthropomorphic and somehow together, and the groupings then would have meaning to him. But it's almost like a safe space. It's something, a safe material in which to kind of play and experiment.
That's a good analogy, and it's also liberating. I'm thinking of something that Kenneth Nolan told me when he first started painting the circles, which is of course what first established his reputation. He explored many different formats, and then he figured out that if he started with the circle on a square canvas, then he could focus on the things that he was really interested in, which was interval and color and edge and paint application. And by working in series, he didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. He could concentrate on those things that he was really deeply concerned with, and not have to think about anything else. And of course, at a certain point, he got tired of the circle and it started shifting into other things, and did at intervals over the years. But you could argue that the trees served very much the same function for Ascher. It was a form he felt in charge of. He could vary it, but he didn't have to reinvent it every time.
That's interesting. What's interesting too, in the example that you just brought up with Kenneth Nolan, is that I feel as though you could sort of go two ways with the reading with Ascher. With the Nolan example you brought up, it's as if it's to a certain degree a quest for perfection, to sort of hone and play with certain elements of the technique. And here is a format that you can use to kind of, all right, this is something familiar, I'm in control of it, it's a form I'm comfortable with, so I can manipulate it until I've perfected the thing that I want to explore. I think on another level, I sort of always feel this way about Picasso's female nudes, which is obviously a much more highly charged subject, but
to say the least.
To say the least, but I do feel like sometimes it's just, oh well, here's something I'm comfortable representing, so now I can explore whatever compositional thing that I'm focusing on. So there's an intentionality and a perfectionism that goes with that type of interpretation. But then on the other side, there's that question, going back to the idea of trauma and aesthetic responses to trauma, where there's the compulsion, right? So it's the compulsion to repeat for whatever reason, whether it's comfort, whether it's the inescapable, something about the subject matter is the only way you can express. And I feel as though it's interesting to think, because we'll never know, but where Ascher falls on that continuum, where the repetitive subject matter is either deliberate, conscious perfectionism, or it is, on the other end of the spectrum, a sort of traumatic response compulsion. I can't get away from these images are in my head. I can't get away from these things. I have to get them out again and again and again and again. It's like, yeah.
Well, perfection is an interesting idea, but I think it's not perfection in the sense of rendering, or I think it's conjuring up a feeling, and whether the need to conjure up that feeling comes from whatever his interior turmoil was, we don't know. but you don't keep doing this unless it makes you feel better in some way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, all artists have this. If they don't make something, they're profoundly uneasy. Um, and I'm basing this on a very long time experience of spending time in studios and spending a lot of time with very, very engaged artists. So was this therapeutic for Ascher? Probably, or he wouldn't have done it. And he's obviously sophisticated enough artist that he is constantly judging, evaluating, making decisions, aesthetic decisions. I mean, the difference between the two tree paintings, the difference between the two sunflower paintings, he isn't just churning out images of trees or images of sunflowers. These are very, very accomplished, deeply considered works, but they're also made with a kind of emotional intensity and directness that he clearly wanted. I suspect it was, you know, if something like, you know, well, you know, is this one talking back to me? I suspect that the ones that didn't talk back to him didn't survive.
Yeah. It's probably true. That's a very interesting perspective. Well, so I'm thinking, returning to the sunflowers in particular, we've talked about the trees, and I want to hear a little bit more about your view of the sunflowers, because they've always, and I've talked to Rachel about this, but they've always struck me as these odd surrogates for family portraits. That's how I've always kind of read them.
That's interesting. That's interesting. They could be. I mean, certainly the figurative sense is there. One talks about and it's built into the way we talk about flowers. We talk about the head of the flower. But if you think about the traditional Northern European, particularly Dutch or Flemish family portrait, you're absolutely right. You know, just getting all those heads in there. And it may very well have had that kind of overtone for him. I mean, certainly it's not an overstatement to say that these individual sunflowers are as personable as the trees. I mean, they do start reading as faces. And they're very confrontational. Now, layered onto that is the whole modernist baggage of the sunflower, which anyone paying attention to modern art at the time that Ascher grew up and was formed is certainly going to be totally familiar with Van Gogh. So that's in there too. And he's being very audacious in taking on the sunflower as a subject because of that.
That's very
I love that family portrait analogy. It's interesting.
It's just, ever since I saw, I mean, and it's interesting that you just brought up Van Gogh, because when you say it, it becomes obvious. Of course, how can you not see the Van Gogh sunflowers as, you know, he's taking this on? And I think going back to sort of the motivations behind these sort of later landscapes and turning to sort of natural subject matter as opposed to figurative, the seeds of who he was before the war are still there. His training, his background, his consciousness of wanting to be part of an artistic trajectory, viewed in tandem with the idea that these are in some ways a highly conscious response to Van Gogh's sunflowers from a different vantage point, from a different perspective, with a different, is a very interesting one. It's a very different type of continuity than if we talk about formal continuity with his earlier works. It's the human being sort of, and his training and his background kind of coming to the fore to link him to that very highly educated, highly trained artist working in a modern style or aesthetic before the war. So that's really interesting to think about the implications of that.
Of course, the other thing I always wonder about is how, just what was the art scene in post-war Germany. I know a little bit about people like, Emil Schumacher, who was very much influenced by abstract expressionism. And, Ascher was holding himself a bit apart from all that. Of course, he was, middle-aged man. He was in his 50s when he started painting again. And he did resist a certain amount of, when people were starting to be paying attention to him, he was holding back for a while. So I think his relationship to the art world was clearly different than it had been before the war, when he was an ambitious, rising young artist who, clearly knew everything that was going on. These feel much more introspective, and what I know of his history supports that he, while he was not a recluse, that he was more inward turning.
Mm-hmm. Which would put the sort of points of artistic reference as sort of a static point before his persecution would have started. So his reference points, perhaps.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, he could have been keeping up with what was going on and, keeping his own counsel. I mean, again, to use the example of Morandi, who was not persecuted, but had the reputation of being reclusive, which was not quite the case. He was in touch with some of the most important aesthetic thinkers of the day. I mean, he was just as friendly with the guy who made his frames and the guy who repaired the boiler. But he did live in the same apartment with his mother and sisters on the street, same street that his family had lived on since he was born. They moved once to another building in the same street. And he too, while keeping himself very much to himself, was very aware of what was going on in the contemporary art world. His library was full of catalogs and books about younger artists. And at one point he said in relation to abstract expressionism that he was glad that he wasn't a young artist at that time, because he would have found it too confusing. So I don't know how aware Ascher was of what was happening elsewhere. There were post-war exhibitions of contemporary American art traveling in Europe a bit later. I don't know enough about what the tours were. I know they certainly got to France and to England, and I think some of them did go to Germany. But I suspect he knew exactly what was going on, and he was, had found his own path.
He was making a choice. This was his.
Yeah.
I want to turn to another of, speaking of the consistent themes, the finding his subjects, finding his approach. So one of the other, in addition to the trees and the sunflowers, one of the other fairly consistent natural themes he returns to in this later period are these sunrises and sunsets, in addition to moonrises and things like that. It's I find there are multiple ways, obviously, you can read these, but how do you view this theme or this subject matter interest?
Well, I think there's a couple of big late paintings, like the sunset, 1960 sunset you have on the right. They're just terrific paintings. I mean, that's really the first thing to be said about them. When I saw the exhibition installed at the Gray Art Gallery, and they were at the end, they were just like a great climactic finale. They were really, really were potent. And they are clearly about everything that he's most interested in, which is color and expression and drama, filtered through this, as we've been discussing, to put it in shorthand, neutral subject matter. It's not like the agile, expressive, intensely colored figures of his pre-war paintings, but it has just as much potency and just as much feeling. So, you know, they're highly simplified. They suggest that he knew exactly what the younger abstract expressionist painters were doing, and it's a kind of a, okay, kids, I can do this too, which sometimes happens. I mean, there are Hans Hofmann paintings that Helen Frankenthaler, who was a good friend of his and a very not really, had only been a student of his for 2 weeks, many years before. But when she looks at the particular group of Hoffmans, she said, "Oh yeah, that was Hans saying, 'Okay, kids, this is how you do it.'" You know? So there are many instances of you know, artists looking at each other in oblique ways. You know, late Miro looks as though he was looking at what Adolf Gottlieb got out of him and trying to take it back. So whatever the impetus for these paintings, it's a kind of very natural evolution from the trees and the sunflowers, and that he's still dealing with a recognizable theme from the natural world, but he's pushing it even further. Would he have turned into an abstract painter? Who knows? He might not have ever wanted to lose that thing that you could connect to. But he's certainly simplifying to see how much you can leave out and still have something that reminds you of natural phenomena.
Absolutely. I was actually, as you were just talking and looking at these on the screen, that reduction of form to basically an orb, a diagonal line that bisects the painting, and then color fields of 2 different kinds that are performing some sort of contrast, whether in line and technique or in color or a combination of both. It's just, as you say, sort of a very simplified, almost abstract, but not quite, exploration towards the end, which is interesting to think about the implications and where he might have gone next, or if this was kind of the pinnacle of his explorations. I want to return to your point about what he would have, the connection between abstract expressionist technique and works such as these. Where, if you wouldn't mind, what specifically are you seeing when you're making that link? Which pieces of abstract expressionist practice do you see as being consciously or deliberately or not invoked in these works?
Well, certainly the notion of the canvas as an all-over expanse that is inflected equally, rather than an illusionistic reference of any kind. The notion of the paint being applied in very free ways in which gesture is very visible. And the idea that you can, as I said, leave an awful lot out and still have something interesting to look at. I don't see in these, for all their intensity, the kind of self-conscious Sturm und Drang evocation of anxiety that most of the abstract, but they're the cool abstract expressionists, and the gestural abstract expressionists. Irving Sandler was very good at making those distinctions, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And there's none of this wet into wet drag paint. There's none of this sense of contingency that it looked like a different painting and it could still look like another painting. There's some of that is implied by the layering of the strokes in the sunset painting, but you don't have that sense of no, this is unfinished. This will go on forever. This is very much, this is how I wanted it to look. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but they don't have that tentative quality that you get into a lot, particularly in the de Kooning imitators.
That's really interesting, and I see exactly what you're saying, because it's not, as you say, with the layering that you have with other artists, where it's as if, as you say, they started in one direction and they're changing in something else. So there's this idea of, as you say, it's never finished. It's an ever evolving, potential image. Here, everything is consistent. Even if you have layers of color, they're all along the same lines. I think even if we're looking at the sort of central sun image, right? The sort of long diagonal brush strokes, there may be layer upon layer of color, but you never get a sense that underneath at the very bottom layer, maybe he was doing, short, more pointillist things. It all is in the service of a very clear and fixed type of vision that may happen to layer color, but it's not, as you say, that kind of constant potential for something else that you find with some of the abstract expressionist painters or other painters as they're working. And that's it's an interesting link back to that idea of him finding his niche towards in his later years. He knows what he wants. He knows what he wants to represent. How he does it is the piece that invites variation rather than what it is that he is doing.
That's a very good way of putting it. And it also, something that comes through even on the screen is just how much he loves moving paint around. He just loves the sensuality of paint as much as he loves color, and the works on paper, the flow of the gouache or the ink, and there's this sense of the sensuality of the gesture. The fluidity of the medium that comes through no matter what the subject is.
It's interesting to sort of think about that love of that pleasure, right, that he's taking in paint, the process of painting, and the idea of representing. And it feels, going way back to the beginning of the conversation where you were describing these to a certain degree as a freedom. There's a freedom of expression that happens here as opposed to in his earlier works. To what degree should we view these as sort of along the lines of a stereotypical idea of a late style, as opposed to when we're reading it through the lens of a direct, say, trauma response? I think about when we think about late style and the stereotype of, well, now the artist is free in order to be able to create as he or she sees fit, and it's a pure expression of those initial aesthetic concerns that the artist may have been working through and under pressure to work through in younger years. But here, now Ascher is free. He's doing what he wants. Is this the natural endpoint or natural conclusion of his earlier work along the sort of theory of a late style in your mind?
Well, not everyone is granted a late style.
True.
You have to live a long time, for one thing.
True. Fair.
That was always Clement Greenberg's advice to artists whenever he was asked at the end of a lecture, what advice would you give to younger painters? And he would always say, live a long time. He said, Van Gogh would have died a rich man if he hadn't killed himself at 30. But it's also, I'm being facetious, but you also need to keep pushing yourself in a way. many artists will keep doing something which is essentially the same thing once they have found what they feel good about or that satisfies them. And others will keep exploring and becoming more extreme in ways that we usually call it. It's hard to know because, Ascher didn't live a very long time. But you can see this as the whole post-war period as a late style, as having been, in a sense, reborn after the years of hiding, and finding ways of working that he was satisfied by and stimulated by. But you could also say that this kind of very expressive gesture and expressive intense color goes right back to his earliest predilections. He's never a conventional painter. He's always a supercharged painter.
There's a bigness to the choices that he's making, for lack of a more eloquent way of phrasing it.
That's a good way of putting it. A good way of putting it. I mean, even the small works on paper, the small trees and the small sunflowers are monumental. They have big scale. They can be on a, piece of paper. It's about 12 by 14 and they feel like monuments. So bigness is definitely built in there.
Now, just returning to that sort of nuts and bolts of technique. I mean, obviously, visually, we talked about the difference between his earlier and then his later work in landscapes. You can see that freedom in the gesture, but how would you describe his landscapes, the technique of them, in your mind?
Look at the background of the loner.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the way the musculature is dealt with. He's still putting on paint very much the same way. Mm-hmm. It's not. He's not filling in. Every mark looks like he really meant it from the first moment, which is part of what you alluded to when we were talking about the gesture in the later work, that he's, everything he puts down looks like he fully intended it to be that way. And whether he's being more descriptive as he is in the musculature of the loner, or he's being more elusive as he is in the clouds and the background, you can find that quality, say, in the way he treats the tree trunks, or the way he treats the sunset. So that hasn't changed. That's very fundamental. It's not like he went from being a tight illusionistic worker to a,
all of a sudden a more gestural.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you could argue that it's not that he's changed; he just got more so.
That's an excellent point, and maybe that is sort of the answer. Is that I think we're very primed to see a difference, and there is certainly a difference in earlier versus later works, but we're primed to see it because we're focusing on the subjects.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, and we're saying, well, here we had people, very distinct, Michelangelo-esque bodies. We have narratives that are very clear, versus in the landscape work we're looking at something that is less so in terms of narrative. So we're primed to focus on subject, as opposed to, well, actually, when you start to think about it, the landscapes in the later works are, as you say, perhaps a natural extension or a natural sort of exemplification of everything he's been doing from the beginning. And maybe it's just our minds that are our biases that are coming into play to kind of make a much clearer distinction than there actually is. So.
Well, clearly he was changed
Mm-hmm.
from this horrendous experience.
Right.
But he was still Ascher.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I'm curious also, so you mentioned his poetry, and obviously, as we know, during the war, while he was in hiding, you know, poetry was the medium that he used to express himself, or that he could use to express himself. How do you view, if you view, a connection between these artworks done after the war and his poetic expressions, if you view a connection at all?
Well, I'm operating under handicap because I know his poetry only in translation.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I'm missing a good deal because I listen to enough Lieder, which I'm addicted to understand the importance of repeated sounds. But when I did the catalog of a small show of Ascher's works on paper for the New York Studio School, I ended the catalog essay with one of Ascher's poems because I thought it was so apt in terms of the mood and the feeling of the work that was on exhibition. And this was, think about this, I happen to have it here. Think about this in relation to the sunflowers. Love flowers, extending and eternal. Always I feel myself excited by all the changes, by all the paths. Always I feel myself aglow with passion. That's pretty intense. All that feeling that we're seeing in the color and the brush marks and the gesture seems to be in the poetry as well. It was clearly a surrogate for the kind of encapsulation of feeling that goes into the paintings. The poems are not dated, as far as I know, and a question that I had never thought of before is whether he continued to write poetry after he came out of hiding and started painting again. I don't know who knows the answer to that.
We may never know.
We never know. We never know. If he'd only dated his poems, it would be so much easier.
Sign and date your work always.
Sign and date your work. Right.
But that's really interesting because it is, as you're reading that poem, exactly as you're describing it, is, as you say, there in terms of the color, in terms of how the line and that energy that comes through with the sunflower paintings and the works on paper.
I feel myself aglow with passion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's the sunset painting.
Yep. That's so interesting.
He doesn't have the little Caspar David Friedrich figure,
No.
but he has all the emotion.
Right. Which perhaps is more poignant in many ways, I think. Well, this is wonderful, Karen. Thank you so much. I think we are at the end of close to the end of our time. So I wanted to know if you had any sort of closing thoughts or responses to Ascher's landscapes that you wanted to share.
I think we've covered it very well. Your questions were very, very complete. My one overwhelming question is, did he write any poetry after he came out of hiding? That's something I hadn't thought about before. Thank you so much for doing this, Elizabeth.
Oh, no, thank you. This was wonderful. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Karen and Elizabeth, for this fabulous interview. Thank